In this lesson, we're going to do another live screencast using Adobe Lightroom. This time, we're going to learn about the 6 editing effects that we talked about a few lessons ago. We'll take those same cornbread pictures that we imported and organized in the previous lesson, and here we'll apply those 6 techniques that we talked about in Lightroom to get these pictures looking beautiful. So let's get started with that screencast. In the previous video on Lightroom, we spent all of our time in this Library tab, which is where we manage our pictures and our workflow. But here we're going to actually do some editing effects, and for that we're going to use the Develop tab. We're going to take one of these cornbread pictures and go through the 6 editing effects that we talked about and actually do them in real time to get a good feel for how this process works. So first we'll go to our cornbread stuffing collection, which is where again we saved our 13 favorite pictures from this photo set. And what I do is I'll usually look at each of these. To look at them larger, you click this square tab versus the grid in this middle section. So just click on the square to see a larger image of each of them. And I usually go through and look at which ones are my favorite of the favorites. And for those, I'll drag them to the beginning of the collection just to kind of reorder them so all my favorites are right at the beginning. So which ones of these I'm looking for convey the right elements that I want, which first of all is clarity and realism. Which ones look real? Which ones look delicious? Which ones tell the best story? And I can't say I'm overly thrilled with this photo shoot. It looks decent, but it's not extraordinary. Now I like this picture because the stuffing naturally isn't very pretty. And do you remember what I said about how to make ugly food look better? You get closer. So notice how this close-up on one of the chunks of the cornbread is really kind of nice and adds a lot of depth. So I really like this picture. I'm going to save it as one of my favorite of the favorites towards the beginning. And maybe that one as well. So these are the 4 that I think have the most potential in this photo set. This one, however, is probably my favorite so far. I like how it's real and it's clear. There's a wine bottle in the background. You can kind of see what's going on pretty well, and I think it has a nice story with the spoon in the dish. So let's edit this one for our purposes. So we're finally going to move over to the Develop tab. Remember, we have Library, Develop, and then Map, Book, Slideshow, Print, and Web are pretty much useless. We don't need to worry about those. So watch what happens when we go to the Develop tab. 2 things change. The left side changes and the right side changes. In the bottom, we still have access to our collection. We can see all the pictures in this collection. And in the center, we still have access to our picture. But along the left, we have a history. This shows us every effect we make to our picture. For example, if I just quickly move the exposure down to nothing and move it back, notice how that's 2 exposure changes that showed up in our history. And this is an important aspect of Lightroom. The pictures on our computer are never being modified. When we make a change to an image, it's called non-destructive editing. The editing effects are saved in a file somewhere else that simply tell Lightroom how to make the picture look like we want it to look like, while the original picture is still in that folder organized by date. It's never being touched, never knows nothing is happening to it, and it's sitting there in its original form. So we can do whatever we want to our pictures, make mistakes, edit them, whatever effects we do, they're all saved in this history, and then we can undo it and just go back to an original state or to see what the previous steps were. So that's really important, and I hope you can understand that point, that your pictures are being non-destructively edited. No matter what you do to them in Lightroom, you can always go back. The other difference is on this right-hand panel. Now we have a whole set of editing effects. You can see exposure, contrast, clarity, saturation, white balance. Hopefully some of this sounds familiar. You can also see down here in the detail panel that we have the noise reduction element. And we've already talked about all these techniques. We've had a quiz on them. So now we get to actually put them into practice. First up, as I said, what I first do is I look at the crop and the straightening. So to do that on Lightroom, it's under the histogram in this first section here. You can see the crop with the little grid. Click on that and adjust your image to show you the 3x3 grid, or the rule of thirds. You can crop it just by simply moving in one of the corners. So if we wanted to crop it like this, we could do that. We could hit done, and that's what our picture would look like. But we don't want to do that, so we just go to our history panel and undo that, or you could hit just Command Z. But what we do want to do is take a look at the crop and see if it's how we want it to be. And actually for this picture, I think the crop is already perfect. I can't imagine bringing in either side. That would look kind of weird. I can't imagine bringing in the top too much. Maybe a little, but that's really not necessary. If we wanted to, we could bring it down to here and get rid of the gray or the chalkboard in the background. So let's just do that for this picture. But we also don't need to straighten it because it's already straight. So straightening, you look at one of the corners and then you get the little arrows in the opposite directions, and when you hold down your mouse, you drag it and it twists the image to the left, or if you hold your mouse to the right, twist it to the right. So if we needed to straighten our image slightly, we could do that, but we really don't. It looks pretty good. So let's just undo that, and we'll leave the picture just like that. We'll crop out the top just a little bit and click Done. If you remember, the second technique that I like to look at is white balance. Remember, white balance controls how warm or cool the image is, or in other words, how blue or yellow the image is. And we want to adjust our white balance so that the whites look as white as possible. These two things here control the white balance. If we want, we can pick up this eyedropper and pick a neutral target, and it'll automatically adjust our white balance to those levels. If we undo that, it's a little bit more blue, but not too much. See? Very little difference. That's how I usually do this. I'll take the eyedropper and I'll put it on a very white, and then it'll adjust it just a little bit and give me the right color. If I don't like how it did it, then I will simply adjust the dials myself. So right now the temperature is at 5,000. We could move it way down here just to get a dramatic example, and it looks really blue. We can move it way up here and it looks really yellow. But again, we'll just type in 5,000, which is where it was. And I think that's just about the white balance. Wouldn't you agree? It looks pretty natural in terms of the coloring. The third thing we take a look at is exposure. This, again, controls how much light is in the image. This whole section, other than contrast, determines the exposure. So we can adjust the straight exposure with the one dial. There's also the highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. We can adjust these individually to control different parts of the exposure and to get the best look possible. What I usually do is I click this auto button, and it looks terrible. It messes everything up. But I like to see how they do it and where they send me as a starting point. In this case, I'll just undo that and adjust these manually. So I think we need to add a little bit more brightness by bumping up the exposure. For the internet, a little bit too bright is better than a little bit too dark. You don't want to go overboard, but you do want a little bit more brightness in your picture. Then I adjust these four variables independently. The highlights in this picture actually look a little bit bright, and the highlights are the really white parts of the picture where there's a lot of white contrast. So we can bring that down a little bit. We still have most of our brightness, you see, but the highlights aren't just overflowing. So we'll bring that down just a tad. Now the shadows in this picture are kind of dark. You can see under the spoon and between the pieces of stuffing, it looks a little bit dark. So we can actually brighten the shadows. And see how that brings out a little bit more brightness into the picture without messing up the whites? And then we can do the same thing for whites and blacks, which are similar to highlights and shadows. We can bump up our whites a little bit. Does that look good, or do we want to darken our whites? And this is kind of how I do it. I just kind of go back and forth until I see what looks best. So our whites are, let's go with a little bit brighter whites. For blacks, do we want that darker? No, we don't want it darker. We probably have a little bit lighter to neutral blacks. Maybe we'll just keep that at 0. And I would say our color's looking pretty good. Maybe if we go up one more to plus 60 on the exposure, and that's slightly overexposed. Let's go back down to 50, and we'll keep it there at 50 exposure, a little bit extra highlights and whites, and it looks pretty decent in terms of the exposure. The next thing we adjust, and I usually don't spend too much time on this, is the contrast. Now remember, the contrast is the distance between the whites and the blacks. How much variation do you have in your picture? So if we go to no contrast, you can see they both turn into gray. The bright whites and the dark blacks are both gray. If we go way up to plus 100, the whites are really white and the blacks are really black. So we certainly don't want either of those extremes. If we go to plus maybe 50, it's still way too extreme. Minus 50, it's still too dull. But at 0, I think this picture, because it's stuffing and it's got really dynamic texture, we could add just a little bit more contrast. So we'll bring it up to like maybe plus 12 or so. It gives us a little bit more depth without making it look too unrealistic. The next thing I usually take a look at is sharpness. And in Lightroom, it makes it very easy to adjust the sharpness, in a sense, by just moving the clarity. Now this clarity slider here is something I always pay attention to. We can go way up on clarity and make it look terrible. We can go way down on clarity and make it look horrible. So what you want to do is just move this a few points, plus or minus. So in this case, we move it down too far and it looks too blurry. At 0, it looks okay. We can bump it up to maybe 7 and we get a little bit more detail. Notice that? From -9 to +8, we get a little bit more detail. So let's put that at +8 just to kind of give us a nice medium range. We don't want to go too far on this. One other thing I usually take a look at is the noise reduction. This picture had fairly good lighting, but if you see this super zoomed in crop on the side, it shows us a good example of how much noise is in the picture on a full size. And as you can see, that's quite a bit of noise actually. This picture was taken at an 800 ISO, which isn't extraordinarily high, but it's a little high. So if we bring up the noise reduction, looking over here on this right side first, how does that look at about 40? I think that helps quite a bit. Now if we look back at our image in full size, how does it look over here versus 0 versus 40? And there's not a huge difference, so let's leave that at 40. So that's our noise reduction element, which can help in some pictures. In this case, it's not going to do much for us. One last thing I want to take a look at is spot removal. I didn't talk about this in the editing effects, but if your picture has spots on it, you can actually remove them dynamically here by using this spot removal tool. So you can control the size and how opaque it is. This is about the right size, and there's just burned crumb over here in my picture. So let's remove that just by clicking and dragging to another point. So what we're doing here, we're taking the color and the image from where the large circle is and replacing that with the color from the other point. So we moved this from this circle to this circle. So it dynamically replaced this image with the image that's over here. So that way you can take one white part and put it on another white part, and then it will use the technology to kind of blur it together so it looks natural. And we hit done, and notice that our spot's gone. So that's another nice tool that's built into Lightroom. So this is our final picture. And usually I'll do all those edits, and then I'll come back and look at it again fresh and say, okay, how does this picture look? And right now, I actually feel like there's a little bit too much contrast. So let's move the contrast back down to 0. It seemed a little unrealistic the way the whites were too bright and the blacks were too dark. Also, the shadows could be bumped up just a little bit. So I do take a look again after I'm done to see how the picture looks, to make sure it looks realistic and is telling the kind of story that I want it to tell. So one other thing we can do is actually compare this one to the previous. So that's what it looked like originally, and this is what it looks like now. I'd say that's a big improvement. Before it was kind of dark and the levels were off, and over here it looks a lot better. It's clearer, crisper, looks more realistic, you can see the details better. So let's give ourselves a pat on the back. We did a good job editing this set, and we're pretty much done with the picture. Your homework for this lesson is to put into practice the things we just talked about in the video. I'd like you to take 3 or 4 sample images and try to apply the same effects that we used to get the same kind of results for your pictures. You can either use images you have yourself, food photos you've taken or other photos, or in this lecture I've added some supplementary material that you can download. These are 3 pictures of my own that are unedited in their original state as they came out of the camera. One of them is actually the cornbread picture that we edited. So if you need some samples, use those. Try to get them as beautiful as you can using these techniques. And in the next lesson, we're going to talk about how to use your mobile phone to do this kind of editing on a more limited basis if you don't have access